The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl cornered behind his childhood shed, and his fury shook the old town awake. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's incredible story. It was a cold winter night, and the small town of Cedar Ridge lay still under the weight of the first snow of the season. Most of the town was quiet, with only the occasional flicker of a porch light or the hum of an old heater breaking the silence. But something was stirring behind the thick woods that surrounded the town, behind the old shed that had witnessed so many years of the biker's childhood. Jake Reaper Morrison, once a feared member of the Hells Angels, was riding his Harley through the familiar streets of his hometown. The engine's growl echoed in the cold air as he passed the landmarks of his youth, places he used to call home, now covered in snow and dusted with time. He was here for the first time in years, having left behind the violent world of the Hells Angels, seeking solace in the quietude of the past. But as he neared the old shed, something caught his attention. A faint cry, barely audible over the hum of his motorcycle, rang through the trees. At first, Jake thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but as he slowed his bike, the sound came again, this time clearer. A voice, weak and desperate. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled over, his boots hitting the snow-covered ground with a heavy thud. He had been trained for many things, fighting, surviving, and escaping, but nothing had prepared him for the scene that awaited him. Behind the shed, crouched in the corner of the abandoned lot, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7 or 8, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She was trembling, her arms wrapped tightly around her body, her eyes wide with fear. A group of older men loomed nearby, their intentions clear and dangerous. Jake's blood boiled. His fists clenched around the handlebars as his instincts kicked in. He hadn't come back to this town for anything but peace. But now, standing in front of him, was someone who needed his help. Without thinking, Jake dropped his bike and rushed toward the girl, his boots crunching through the snow as he approached the scene. The men turned, surprised by his sudden presence, but Jake didn't care. His mind was focused on one thing, protecting the innocent. What's going on here? Jake's voice was low, a growl that made the air vibrate. The men hesitated, their eyes darting between each other. They were used to intimidating people, used to scaring others into submission, but something about Jake's presence made them uneasy. His leather jacket, covered in patches, his weathered face, and the scars on his knuckles, they all spoke of a man who had seen it all. "Stay out of this, old man," one of them sneered, but Jake's gaze didn't waver. "I don't think you understand," Jake said, taking a step forward. "You're going to walk away. Now." The man who spoke sneered again, but before he could say anything else, Jake's fury erupted. His hand shot out like a lightning bolt, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him against the old shed. The others backed off, their bravado melting away as they realized they were facing a man who wasn't afraid to make them regret their actions. The little girl, still trembling, looked up at Jake with wide, terrified eyes. He knelt down, his face softening for the first time since he'd stepped off his bike. "It's okay," Jake said, his voice gentle, almost unrecognizable compared to the angry tone moments before. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." The girl didn't speak, but the terror in her eyes began to fade as Jake carefully picked her up and walked her to his bike. The men, realizing they had lost, slunk away into the darkness, their footsteps lost in the snow. As Jake settled the girl behind him on the bike, he felt a strange pang in his chest. This wasn't how he had planned to spend his night. But as the bike roared to life, and the sound of the engine filled the air, Jake knew one thing for certain. His past, filled with anger and violence, had brought him to this moment, but it was his future that would define him now. The ride back to Jake's garage was longer than expected. The snow had begun to fall heavier, thick flakes swirling around them as he carefully maneuvered his Harley through the narrow, icy streets. The little girl, wrapped tightly in his leather jacket, clung to him as if he was her lifeline. Her small body trembled with cold, and Jake could feel the fear still radiating off her. He had seen a lot in his life, enough to make a man's heart hard as steel, but something about the terror in her eyes, the vulnerability of someone so young, rattled him in a way he didn't understand. The town was quiet as they rode through, the stillness only broken by the rumbling engine of the bike and the occasional crunch of tires against the snow. As they reached the outskirts, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The streets were too empty. It was a small town, sure, but there was always someone out on a night like this. His mind, always on high alert, raced with possibilities. Were those men following him? Had they seen him pick up the girl? The bike's engine seemed louder now, cutting through the silence like a warning. But as he pulled into the dimly lit garage, the tension in his chest loosened just a bit. At least here, he had control. At least here, he could keep her safe. He helped the girl off the bike, steadying her small frame as she stumbled a little on the slippery concrete. She looked up at him, her face still pale, eyes wide with confusion. He could tell she was scared, but there was something else in her eyes, a silent gratitude, maybe. Jake didn't know what to say. He wasn't the kind of guy who comforted people. But right now, he felt something deep inside him shift. Something that hadn't moved in a long time. He kneeled down to her level, brushing the snow from her hair. "You're safe now," he said softly. The words felt strange coming out of his mouth. He wasn't used to being gentle, used to being a protector without showing weakness. But there was something about her that made him want to do more than just keep her out of harm's way. She looked at him, her lips trembling slightly, and then finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." It was simple, but the way she said it, the way she looked at him, made Jake feel like he had done something important. Like he had done something right for once. He took her hand, guiding her into the small room where he kept his tools and spare parts. It wasn't much, a cluttered space with a single light hanging from the ceiling, the smell of motor oil and rust filling the air. But it was his, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like the only place in the world where things made sense. "Let's get you cleaned up," Jake said, his voice gruff but caring. He grabbed a towel from a nearby shelf and gently wiped the dirt from her face. She winced when he touched a bruise on her cheek, but didn't pull away. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. The sound of the wind outside howling against the garage walls was the only noise as Jake worked, his hands steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He hadn't thought much about his past since he'd left the Hells Angels, but tonight everything felt like it was crashing back in. The anger, the guilt, the things he had done that he couldn't undo. He looked at the girl, her innocent eyes still holding a quiet strength. She had been through something terrible, and yet she still trusted him. He had no idea how, but she did. It was in the way she didn't fight him when he moved her to sit on the couch, the way she accepted the warm blanket he gave her without hesitation. Jake ran a hand through his graying beard, feeling the weight of the years pressed down on him. He wasn't the man he used to be. The things he'd done in the past, things he was not proud of, had brought him here, to this moment. But maybe this was his chance to change. Maybe this was his chance to do something good, to make up for the years he had spent running, fighting, hurting others. He could hear her breathing softly now, the tension in her body slowly relaxing. He knew she had been through a lot, but so had he. And maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. As Jake stood up and began to make a pot of coffee, he noticed the girl looking around the room, her gaze falling on an old photograph hanging on the wall. It was a picture of Jake when he was younger, standing with a group of his old brothers. The memories that photo brought flooded back, but he didn't need to dwell on them now. "What's your name?" Jake asked, glancing back at her. "Ella," she replied, her voice still soft but growing in strength. "Ella," Jake repeated. "Well, Ella, you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." Ella nodded, but Jake could see that she still had questions, things she was too afraid to ask. He understood. He didn't need to explain everything to her right away. He just needed to make sure she was okay. The storm outside raged on, but inside the garage, the warmth of the small room began to feel like a haven. Jake poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Ella, who accepted it with a hesitant smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like maybe he was exactly where he needed to be. I sat there in the dim light of the garage, staring at the cup of coffee in my hand. The room was quiet now, except for the faint hum of the heater in the corner. Ella had finally relaxed, her breathing deep and steady as she drifted into a light sleep on the couch. I watched her for a moment, still struggling to understand what had happened. How did she end up there, behind that shed, cornered by those men? And why did it feel like I was supposed to protect her, like I had been pulled back into this town for a reason? I ran my fingers through my graying beard, trying to make sense of everything. My life had been a series of escapes, running from one problem to the next, never looking back. But now, with Ella here, something was different. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this kind of responsibility, but I knew I couldn't turn my back on her. I had learned that lesson the hard way. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling and rattling the old garage. It was as if the world outside was trying to remind me of everything I had left behind. I glanced at the window, watching the snow fall in heavy sheets, covering everything in white. I hadn't been back here in years, not since I left the Hells Angels behind. I thought I could escape it all, that the past would stay buried, but now I was right back where I started. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling of unease that settled in my chest. Ella stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and she looked at me with those same wide, uncertain eyes. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice rough from the long silence. She nodded, but I could see the lingering fear in her gaze. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for helping me." I didn't know how to respond to that. The words felt too simple for everything that had happened. "You're safe now," I said, my voice softer than usual. "You don't have to worry about them anymore." She nodded again, but there was something in her eyes that told me she wasn't so sure. I could see the weight of her fear still clinging to her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. I didn't blame her. The world wasn't a kind place for people like her, people who had been hurt and abandoned. And the truth was, I didn't know how to help her. I didn't know if I was even capable of it. My past had taught me to fight, to survive, but it hadn't taught me how to heal. I stood up, the weight of my thoughts heavy on my shoulders. "I'll get you some more blankets," I said, trying to sound calm, like I had everything under control. Ella didn't respond, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was still scared, but I could tell she was also trying to trust me, and that meant something. I went to the small closet in the back of the garage and pulled out a few more blankets. When I returned, Ella was sitting up, her small hands resting in her lap. She didn't look up as I draped the blanket over her, but I could feel her eyes on me. I knew she was still thinking about what happened, about the men, about the danger she had faced. I couldn't blame her. If I had been in her shoes, I would have been thinking the same thing. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked, sitting down beside her. She looked at me for a moment, her face serious. "I don't know what to say," she replied softly. I didn't want them to hurt me. My heart clenched at her words. She was just a kid, and yet she had already experienced so much pain. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she didn't deserve any of it, but I didn't know if that would make a difference. Sometimes, words weren't enough. "You're not alone anymore," I said instead. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." She didn't answer, but her gaze softened, and for the first time since I'd found her, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was a small thing, but it meant everything to me. The wind outside howled louder, but in the garage, it was warm. I sat there with Ella for a while, the two of us silent, each lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't change what had happened to her, but I could keep her safe now, and that was something. As the hours passed, the storm outside finally began to subside. The snow had slowed, and the winds had died down. I could see the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the small window above the workbench, casting long shadows across the room. I stood up and stretched, feeling the ache in my bones. It had been a long night. "You should get some rest," I said, glancing over at Ella. She nodded, wrapping herself tighter in the blankets. "Good night," she whispered, her voice soft but sincere. "Good night," I replied. I turned off the light and made my way to the small cot in the corner of the garage. As I lay down, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. I had spent years running from my past, from the man I had been. But now, with Ella here, I didn't have that luxury anymore. I had to be something better, not just for her, but for myself too. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure where this path would lead, but I knew I couldn't walk away. I had to stay. The storm had passed, but my journey was just beginning. I woke up to the sound of the wind howling outside, the first rays of sunlight creeping through the cracks in the old garage window. It was still early, the kind of quiet hour that made everything feel peaceful. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned over, the cot creaking under my weight, and saw Ella still asleep on the couch, wrapped in the blankets I had given her the night before. She looked small, vulnerable, but at least she was safe now. Or so I hoped. My mind raced with the things I had seen and heard over the last 24 hours. I had found Ella behind the shed, cornered and terrified, and brought her here. The men who had chased her, what had they wanted? And why did it feel like they weren't going to give up so easily? I stood up quietly, not wanting to disturb her, and moved toward the workbench in the back of the garage. The cluttered space was exactly how I remembered it, tools scattered across the wooden counter, old motorcycle parts lying in piles, and grease stains on the floor. It was a mess, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, it felt like home. I rubbed my hand across my face, feeling the rough stubble on my jaw, and took a deep breath. I couldn't keep running from my past. Not anymore. I had to face what was coming, whether I was ready or not. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. I grabbed a rag from the shelf and wiped down the workbench, my thoughts swirling. I had spent years in the Hells Angels, doing things I wasn't proud of, building a reputation that was as much fear as it was respect. But now I was here, in this small garage, with a little girl who needed someone to believe in her. Someone who wouldn't let her down like everyone else had. The storm had passed, but the lingering chill in the air reminded me that there were still things out there waiting to be dealt with. Things I couldn't ignore any longer. I needed to find out more about those men. I needed to know why they had been after Ella. As I worked, my mind kept drifting back to her. The way she had looked at me when I found her, the fear in her eyes slowly starting to fade. I had done what I could to keep her safe for now, but I knew the danger wasn't over. I had been part of the Hells Angels long enough to know that a threat didn't just disappear. It came back, and I had no intention of letting anyone harm her again. After a while, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw Ella standing in the doorway, rubbing her eyes and looking a little lost. She was still wrapped in the blanket, her hair tangled and messy, but there was something in her gaze that made me stop. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. She was strong. Stronger than most people I knew. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. Ella nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "I'm hungry," she said quietly, her voice still soft. I smiled, the first real smile I had had in a long time. "I can fix you something," I said. "What do you want?" She hesitated for a moment, then looked up at me with those big eyes. "Anything," she replied. It was such a simple answer, but it hit me hard. She didn't want anything special, just something to fill the emptiness she had been carrying around. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just fixing food. I was fixing something bigger. I stood up and moved toward the small kitchen area in the corner, grabbing some eggs and bacon from the fridge. As I cooked, I glanced over at Ella, who had settled on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket, watching me carefully. I didn't know how long she had been on her own, or what kind of life she had lived before this, but I could tell she wasn't used to being taken care of. She wasn't used to trusting people, but she was trusting me, and that was something I couldn't take lightly. I set a plate of food in front of her and sat down beside her. "Here you go," I said, trying to keep the mood light. "It's not much, but it's something." She smiled a little, taking a bite of the food, and for the first time since I'd found her, she seemed at peace. We ate in silence, the only sound the crunch of food and the soft hum of the heater. I wasn't sure where this would all lead. I didn't know how long I could keep her safe, or how long I could outrun my past. But for the first time in years, I wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. After breakfast, I got to work on the bike. It had been sitting in the corner of the garage, untouched, since I had come back to town. It was a mess, but it was my mess, and fixing it gave me something to focus on. Ella watched me for a while, but then she got up and moved toward the corner of the room where I kept the old tools. She looked at them curiously, her small hands reaching for a wrench. "Can I help?" she asked. I was taken aback. "You want to help?" I asked, not sure if she even knew what she was asking. She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I've seen people work on bikes before. I know a little about it." I raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" She nodded again, her confidence growing. "I can try." I smiled. Maybe she was stronger than I thought. Maybe, in some strange way, we were both here to help each other. I handed her a wrench and showed her how to tighten a bolt on the bike. She was careful, determined, and her small hands worked with surprising precision. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. We weren't just surviving. We were building something. Together. I woke up early the next morning, as usual. The garage was cold, but the heater was doing its job, and the faint smell of motor oil and the faint crackling of the small stove kept things from feeling too empty. I stretched and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of the dreams that had been haunting me for weeks now. Dreams about my old life, the Hells Angels, the choices I had made, and the people I had hurt. But that was the past. I had to focus on the present, on keeping Ella safe. She was still asleep, curled up on the couch, her face peaceful for the first time since I'd met her. She looked like any other kid now, but I knew the truth. She had seen things no child should ever have to see. I couldn't change what had happened to her, but I could make sure she didn't have to go through it alone anymore. The thought of those men, the ones who had chased her, kept me on edge. They hadn't just been thugs. They had been part of something much darker. I didn't know if they were connected to my past, or if they were just another threat to this town, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I had to take action. I got dressed quietly, not wanting to disturb Ella, and moved toward the back of the garage. The bike was almost ready, and there were still a few things I needed to fix before it was good to go. As I worked, my mind kept drifting back to her. How had she ended up there, cornered by those men behind that old shed? What did they want from her? I had to find out. I tightened the last bolt and wiped my hands on a rag, taking a deep breath. It was time to do something. I walked back to the couch where Ella was still asleep, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for her. The past had a way of pulling people back into it, no matter how far they ran. I had run from my own past for years, but now, with Ella here, it seemed like that old life was catching up with me faster than I could escape. I sat down beside her, not wanting to wake her, but needing to make a plan. I couldn't keep hiding from the trouble that was coming. Whatever those men wanted, I had a feeling they wouldn't stop. They had found me once, and I wasn't going to let them do it again. As Ella stirred and slowly opened her eyes, I made up my mind. It was time to face the music. She looked up at me, still groggy but her eyes quickly focusing. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice still soft and unsure. "Morning," I replied, offering a small smile. "You feeling better?" She nodded. "Yeah." There was a long pause, and then she looked at me with that quiet strength that had first caught my attention. "What's going to happen now?" she asked. It was the question I had been asking myself for days. What was I supposed to do? I had brought her here, kept her safe for now, but how long could that last? How long before the people who hurt her came back to finish what they started? I didn't have the answers, but I did know one thing. I wasn't going to let her face it alone. I stood up and began to gather my things. "I'm going to find out who those men were," I said, my voice low but steady. "And I'm going to make sure they never come back." Ella looked at me with a mixture of fear and trust. "You can't do it alone," she said. I paused, meeting her gaze. "I don't plan to," I said, "but I'm going to handle it." I grabbed my jacket and made my way toward the door. Ella stood up, still wrapped in the blanket I had given her. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice stronger now. I turned to her, surprised. "No," I said, trying to sound firm. "This isn't something you need to be involved in." But Ella stood there, her chin lifted in defiance, determination in her eyes. "I'm not staying here," she said. "I want to help." I stared at her for a moment, then sighed. She wasn't going to back down. "Fine," I said, "but you stay close. Understand?" She nodded. I couldn't argue with her anymore. She had been through hell already. If she wanted to help, then maybe she had more strength than I gave her credit for. I stepped outside and swung my leg over the Harley, revving the engine to life. Ella climbed on behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist, and we drove out of the garage into the cold morning air. The streets of Cedar Ridge were still quiet, the snow having settled overnight. The town was waking up slowly, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. I knew what I had to do. I had to find the men who had hurt Ella, find out who they worked for, and put an end to it. I wasn't sure how. I was going to do it, but I would. I owed it to her, and I owed it to myself. The road stretched out before us, and as we rode through the quiet town, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. This wasn't about fighting or running anymore. This was about protecting someone who needed it. And no matter what happened, I wasn't going to let her down. The road ahead was a blur of snow and frozen ground as I drove through the winding streets of Cedar Ridge, my mind still racing with everything that had happened. Ella was behind me, holding on tight, her small arms wrapped around my waist. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of responsibility for her, a weight that had settled deep in my chest. I wasn't used to this, being the one to protect someone, to keep them safe. I had spent too many years taking from others, using fear to get by. But now, with Ella in my life, everything felt different. I had promised her I would keep her safe, and I was going to do everything in my power to make sure nothing happened to her. The sounds of the bike's engine echoed in the quiet of the town, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world had stopped. The usual hustle of Cedar Ridge was absent, and the snow-covered streets seemed peaceful. But I knew better. The peace was just a facade. I had to find those men, the ones who had hurt Ella, and I had to do it quickly. I couldn't let them get away with what they had done. I turned onto a narrow road, the one that led toward the outskirts of town, where the old warehouses stood. That was where I thought they might be hiding, and it was the first place I needed to check. As we approached the area, the atmosphere changed. The quietness of the town faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. The old warehouses loomed ahead, their rusted exteriors and broken windows giving them a haunting presence. The place had always been a little off, even when I was a kid. It had never felt like it belonged in Cedar Ridge, and now, it felt like a perfect hiding place for the kind of people I was looking for. I slowed the bike, scanning the area. The place was deserted, or so it seemed. But something in my gut told me I wasn't alone. I pulled up next to a broken-down building and killed the engine. Ella slipped off the back of the bike, her feet crunching on the snow as she moved beside me. She was quiet, her eyes scanning the area just like I was. "Stay close," I told her. She nodded without saying a word, her expression serious. She wasn't a child anymore. Not after what she had been through. I could see it in the way she carried herself, the quiet strength in her eyes. We approached the warehouse cautiously, each step calculated, each sound amplified by the silence of the snow. I reached for the door, pushing it open slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing in the empty space. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old machinery, the faint smell of gasoline and metal lingering in the air. The darkness swallowed the room, but I could make out shapes in the corners of the warehouse. A few old crates, some broken furniture, and I froze. There, in the far corner, I saw movement. A shadow shifted across the dim light, filtering through the cracked windows. My heart rate quickened, and I motioned for Ella to stay behind me. She nodded, understanding the unspoken message. I took a step forward, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife I kept hidden at my side. The shadow moved again, and this time, I saw him clearly. One of the men who had been with Ella, the one with the scarred face, was standing in the far corner, his back to me. He was talking to someone on the phone, his voice low and threatening. I didn't waste any time. I moved quickly, stepping into the room and drawing my knife. The man didn't hear me until it was too late. I grabbed him from behind, slamming him into the wall with a grunt. The phone slipped from his hand as he struggled, but I had him pinned. "Who else is here?" I growled, my voice low and steady. The man's eyes widened, and he tried to break free, but I tightened my grip. "You don't want to do this," he hissed. I pressed the knife against his throat. "I don't have time for your threats. Where are the others?" The man's face contorted with fear, and I could see the panic building in his eyes. He was about to speak when suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned just in time to see two more men enter the warehouse, their hands on their weapons. They froze when they saw me, but it didn't matter. I was already moving. I let go of the first man, pushing him to the ground, and lunged toward the newcomers. I heard Ella's voice behind me, calm but firm. "We don't want to hurt anyone. We just want to know what you did to her." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I glanced back at her, surprised. She wasn't backing down, not this time. She had the same fire in her as I did. The men hesitated, and I took advantage of the moment. "You've got one chance to walk away," I said, my voice cold and authoritative. The men exchanged a look, and for a second, I thought they might actually back down. But then, without warning, one of them lunged at me, drawing a gun. It all happened in a blur. My instincts took over, and I grabbed his wrist, twisting it to disarm him. The gun fell to the ground, and I drove my fist into his face, knocking him out cold. The last man looked at me, fear in his eyes. "Please, we're just doing our job," he pleaded. "Your job is to hurt people," I shot back. "And I'm not going to let you do it anymore." He backed away, raising his hands in surrender. "We didn't know who she was," he said, his voice shaking. "We were just told to get rid of her. We didn't mean to hurt her." I narrowed my eyes, not buying his story. "Who told you?" I demanded. The man hesitated, and I stepped closer. "Who?" I repeated, my voice cold as ice. Finally, he spoke. "It's the boss. He's got people everywhere. He's the one who wanted her gone." My heart skipped a beat. The boss? I knew then that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. We stood in the cold warehouse, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. The man who had spoken was still trembling, his hands raised in surrender, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just a low-level thug. He was scared, and I could see it in the way he backed away from me. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just been revealed. "The boss," the man had said. "He's the one who wanted her gone." I could feel the weight of those words pressing down on me. This wasn't some random encounter. Ella wasn't just a victim of bad luck. She had been targeted, and someone powerful had sent these men after her. I looked at Ella, standing behind me, still strong, still composed. Her eyes were filled with questions, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. I could see the determination in her face, the same fire that had been burning in me for years. We weren't going to back down. "Where can I find him?" I demanded, my voice low and threatening. The man glanced nervously at his unconscious comrades, then back at me. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice shaking. "You can't stop him. He has people everywhere. Cops, politicians, people who owe him favors. He's untouchable." I felt a chill run through me. It was the kind of thing I had heard before in my old life, the kind of thing that made people disappear without a trace. But I wasn't afraid of men like that. I had faced worse, and I had always come out on top. "Tell me where he is," I said again, my patience running thin. The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the exit as if he were weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "There's a place, out by the old highway. It's a warehouse. That's where he operates out of." I stepped closer to him, my boots echoing on the concrete floor. "And who else is involved?" I asked. The man hesitated, then spoke quickly, his words tumbling out. "I don't know all the names. But there's a group. They're the ones pulling the strings. The boss, he just gives the orders, you know? But the real power, it's with the others. They call themselves the Syndicate. They've been running things for years, quietly. No one suspects them." I felt a wave of anger wash over me. This wasn't just some petty criminals. This was organized, methodical. A syndicate. The kind of thing that could tear a town apart if left unchecked. And if they had their hands in this, I knew I had to bring it all down. "Is there anyone else who knows about this?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rising storm inside me. The man nodded, but before he could say more, I heard a loud bang, followed by the sound of footsteps coming from the direction of the entrance. I turned, my heart rate spiking, but when I saw who it was, I relaxed slightly. It was a woman, tall, with short cropped hair and a leather jacket that looked as worn as mine. She stopped just inside the door, her eyes scanning the room. "Jake," she said, her voice familiar. "Didn't think I'd find you here." I didn't need to ask how she knew my name. I had a feeling it was because she had been looking for me, just like everyone else. "What are you doing here, Ruby?" I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. Ruby was a former associate from my Hells Angels days. We had worked together on a few jobs, but after I left, we lost touch. I didn't expect to see her now, not here. Not with everything that was happening. She shrugged, her eyes still darting around the room. "Heard you were back in town. And I'm guessing it's not for the scenery." She glanced at the men on the floor, then back at me. "Looks like you've already made some friends." I turned back to the man who had given up the information. He was still standing there, his hands shaking. "We're going after the Syndicate," I said, my eyes never leaving Ruby's. "You in?" Ruby raised an eyebrow, then sighed. "Always in, Jake. You know that. But you better be ready for what's coming. This isn't just a few guys in a back alley. If they're as deep as you say, we're talking about a war." I met her gaze, then nodded. "Then let's start it." I turned back to the man, who was now visibly sweating. "You better hope I find out you're telling the truth," I said, stepping closer to him. "Because if you're lying to me, I won't hesitate to end this right here. He nodded quickly, his eyes wide with fear. I'm not lying. I swear. I turned away from him and made my way toward the door. Ruby fell into step beside me. We need to move fast, I said, the weight of the situation settling in. They're not going to wait around for us to make a move. Ruby nodded. I'll make some calls. We'll need backup. I didn't want to drag anyone else into this, but I knew it was inevitable. The Syndicate was too big, too dangerous for just the two of us to take on. We needed more muscle. As we walked toward the exit, Ella followed behind us, still quiet but determined. She had seen the men we had just fought, and I could see the anger building in her. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was hers too. The garage was behind us now, but the road ahead was uncertain. There were no guarantees, no promises of safety. But one thing was clear. We were going to take down the Syndicate, no matter what it took. The storm outside had nothing on the storm that was about to hit Cedar Ridge. I could feel the tension in the air as we pulled up to the warehouse on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind was still biting, cutting through the night like a knife. Ruby had made a few calls, and now we had some backup. I had never been one to work with too many people. Hell's Angels had always been a one-man operation for me. But now, things were different. Ella had been quiet the whole ride here, her small form bundled up behind me on the bike. She had been through more than any child should ever have to face, and I knew this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was hers too. She wanted revenge just as much as I did. I could feel her eyes on my back, sharp and full of determination. The others were parked in a line behind us, their bikes standing silent in the shadows. They were all here for one reason: to help take down the Syndicate. I could see the men approaching the warehouse, their silhouettes just visible through the mist of the evening. Ruby walked up beside me, glancing over her shoulder at the team she had brought with her. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough to reassure me. We had the numbers now, and we had the element of surprise. I could feel the adrenaline kicking in as we made our way toward the building. The place was dark, abandoned, but I could see the faint glow of lights through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I pulled my jacket tighter against the cold, signaling the team to move. The sound of boots crunching on the snow filled the air as we moved toward the entrance. It was time to end this. The man who had spoken to me earlier had given us a lead on where the boss was hiding, but I wasn't going to take any chances. We had to move fast. As I reached the door, I turned to Ruby. Stay close, I said, my voice steady but low. We don't know what we're walking into. She gave a nod, her eyes sharp and alert. She had always been good in situations like this. I reached for the door handle, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard a noise from inside. The unmistakable sound of voices. Low and muffled, but definitely there. I gestured for everyone to stop, holding my breath as I listened. The voices grew louder, then faded, but I could tell there were more people inside. The Syndicate wasn't just a few men. They were a full-blown operation. We needed to be careful. I motioned for Ruby to go around the back with one of the other riders while I took the front. The rest of the crew fanned out, taking up positions around the building. I waited for a few moments, then pushed open the door slowly. The smell of old wood, oil, and metal hit me as I stepped inside. It was dark, but I could make out the shapes of crates and old equipment. We were in a storage area. I moved quietly, making my way deeper into the building. I could hear the voices again, this time clearer. They were in a room further down the hall, talking about something I couldn't quite make out. As I approached, I signaled to the others to stay quiet. The room ahead of me had a small window, and through it, I could see several men gathered around a table. One of them stood out. The boss. The man who had ordered Ella to be taken out. I could feel my fists clench at the sight of him. He was taller than the others, wearing a suit that didn't belong in a place like this, and a cold smirk on his face that made my blood run cold. I was ready to charge in, but then I heard the sound of a door opening behind me. I spun around, my hand instinctively going to the knife at my side, but it was only Ruby. She gave me a quick nod, signaling that she had positioned the rest of the crew around the back. I exhaled slowly, realizing I had to stick to the plan. We take them out quietly, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No unnecessary noise. We're getting answers tonight. Ruby gave me a quick glance, then signaled to the others to move into position. I watched her as she disappeared down the hallway, her movements smooth and calculated. She was a pro. I turned back to the window, watching the boss and his men, trying to make out what they were saying. I couldn't hear clearly, but I could tell they were talking about something important. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment everything changed. I took a deep breath and nodded to myself. We had come this far. We couldn't back down now. The boss needed to know that Cedar Ridge wasn't his to control. I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. We were about to bring down an empire built on fear and violence. And this time, it wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had been hurt by these men. Everyone who had been left to suffer while they hid in the shadows. I moved forward, following the team into the building. The moment of truth was here. We were going to take the fight to them, and we weren't going to stop until it was over. I took a step forward, my boots echoing on the cold concrete as I approached the room where the Syndicate boss and his men were gathered. The tension in the air was palpable. We were so close. I could almost taste the confrontation. I glanced back at the team, all in position, waiting for the signal. Ruby was already inside, moving with the stealth of someone who had been doing this for years. She was ready, and so was I. The room ahead was dimly lit, the shadows stretching across the walls, hiding the faces of the men in there. But I could still see their movements, the way they shifted as they discussed their plans. The boss was standing at the head of the table, his posture commanding, a glass of whiskey in his hand. I could feel the anger building up inside me, remembering everything he had done, everything he was responsible for. I wasn't just here to stop him. I was here to take him down. I motioned for the others to move in. Slowly, quietly, we made our way toward the door, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. I felt the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back control, about making sure people like him couldn't keep ruining lives. As I reached for the door, I heard a muffled voice from inside, followed by laughter. They thought they were safe, that they had everything under control. They had no idea what was coming. I shoved the door open, the force of it slamming against the wall. The boss looked up, his eyes narrowing when he saw me standing there, the team behind me. His smirk faltered for just a second, but he quickly regained his composure. Well, he said, his voice smooth but laced with venom. What do we have here? A man who thinks he can take me down. His words were calculated, but I could see the fear in his eyes. It wasn't the first time he had seen men like me. Angry, determined, willing to do whatever it took. But it would be the last time. You're going to pay for what you've done, I said, my voice low and steady. This ends tonight. The men around the table looked at each other, their expressions shifting from arrogance to uncertainty. I didn't give them a chance to react. Get on the ground, I barked, stepping forward. Ruby moved quickly, taking out the first man who tried to make a move, her hands a blur of precision. The rest of the team followed suit, expertly disarming the others and forcing them to the ground. The boss didn't move. He just stood there, watching the chaos unfold around him, his face a mask of fury. You think you can just waltz in here and take me down? He spat, his voice rising with anger. You have no idea who you're messing with. I took a step closer, my eyes never leaving his. You're nothing, I said, my voice calm but filled with years of resentment. You're just a coward hiding behind other people's fear. I saw his eyes twitch. I knew I had him. He wasn't used to being talked to this way, to someone standing up to him. He had built his empire on intimidation, on control, and now he was losing it. You don't know who you're dealing with, he said again, this time more desperate. I'll have you killed. I have connections everywhere. You'll never get out of here alive. I smiled, the anger in my chest subsiding for just a moment. I don't need to get out, I said. You're going to get out of here. You're going to leave this town and never come back. And if you don't, I'll make sure your entire operation crumbles. The man stood there, frozen, his eyes darting between me and the team. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He knew I had the power to take him down. Slowly, he lowered his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. You think you've won? He muttered, barely above a whisper. This isn't over. It is, I said firmly. It's over for you. For good. I motioned for the team to secure him, ensuring he couldn't make any moves. As they moved in, I turned to Ella, who had been standing at the door, her eyes wide but calm. She had seen the whole thing, the violence, the threat, but she didn't flinch. She was strong. You okay? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She nodded, her gaze meeting mine. I'm fine, she said, her voice steady. I knew you'd do it. I knew you'd stop them. It hit me then. I had done more than just save her. I had given her a future, a chance to move on from the past. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was ours. As the team began to cuff the boss and his men, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. It was over. But I knew that peace in a place like this was fleeting. There would always be another fight, another battle to face. But for tonight, we had won. And that was enough. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance as we made our way out of the building, the quiet town of Cedar Ridge now awake, not from fear, but from the power of standing up for what was right. The sun was starting to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the town of Cedar Ridge as I stood outside the old warehouse, watching the police take the Syndicate's men into custody. It felt surreal. Just hours ago, I had walked into that building ready for a fight, and now, it was over. The men who had caused so much pain for so many years were finally being taken off the streets. But as much as it felt like a victory, there was still a weight in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. We had exposed the Syndicate, but I knew there were more like them out there, pulling strings in the shadows. Ella stood beside me, her eyes focused on the police as they worked. She had been through so much already, but tonight she had seen something change. She had seen what it looked like to fight back, to stand up for what was right, and she had stood by my side the entire time. I glanced over at her, seeing a different kind of strength in her than I had seen before. She wasn't the scared little girl I had found behind the shed anymore. She was resilient. She was becoming someone who could take control of her own life. And I couldn't be prouder. "You did good," I said quietly, my voice rough from the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. She looked up at me, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "We did good," she corrected, her voice steady. It hit me then how much she had grown. She wasn't just looking to me for answers anymore. She was finding her own way, her own strength. I felt a lump form in my throat as I nodded. "Yeah, we did." The last of the Syndicate's men were loaded into the police cars, and the sound of the sirens began to fade into the distance. The town felt quieter now, almost like it was holding its breath. Cedar Ridge had been through a lot, but tonight, it had come alive in a way it hadn't in years. The fear that had gripped it for so long was finally beginning to dissipate. But as I looked around, I knew this wasn't over. There would be more battles, more challenges to face. I had brought down one part of the Syndicate, but there were still others out there, hidden in plain sight. And they wouldn't go down without a fight. I could feel the weight of that truth pressing down on me, but it wasn't a burden I was going to carry alone anymore. Ella had shown me that. We were in this together. I turned to Ruby, who had been standing quietly behind us, watching the scene unfold. She gave me a nod, her expression unreadable. "You did good," I said to her, the words feeling more like a promise than a compliment. She raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk appearing on her face. "I was just doing my job, Jake," she said. But there was something in her eyes that told me she understood. We weren't just allies anymore. We were a team, and we had a lot more to do. Ruby turned to Ella, offering her a smile that was rare for someone like her. "You held your own back there," she said, her voice softer than usual. Ella nodded, her gaze steady. I wasn't afraid. And she wasn't. I could see it now. Ella wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the men who had hurt her, not of the danger that lay ahead. She had faced it all, and come out the other side stronger. I felt a sense of pride in my chest, a kind of hope that I hadn't felt in years. We had taken down the Syndicate's operation in Cedar Ridge, but the battle for this town's soul wasn't over. And I wasn't going to stop fighting until it was. I looked up at the sky as the sun began to rise higher, painting the town in warm light. It was a new day. The past was behind me, and the future stretched out ahead, uncertain, but full of possibility. I knew there would be more to face, more challenges, more battles, but I wasn't afraid anymore. We had come this far together, and we would go even further. Cedar Ridge might have been asleep for years, but now, it was awake. And so were we. As I turned to Ella, I saw her looking up at me, her expression filled with quiet determination. "What now?" she asked, her voice calm but strong. "Now," I said, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "We rebuild." She nodded, her eyes bright. "Together," she said. And I realized then that, no matter what came next, we would face it together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but we would walk it side by side, stronger than ever before. It had been a week since we took down the Syndicate in Cedar Ridge, and while things seemed quieter, I knew the calm was just temporary. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the small town as I rode through the streets on my Harley, the engine humming beneath me like an old, familiar friend. Ella was behind me again, wrapped in her jacket, her small frame holding on tight as we moved through the streets. She wasn't the same person who had been cowering behind the shed just a week ago. Now, she was confident, her gaze sharp, her hands steady. I couldn't help but feel proud of her. She had been through so much, and yet, she had risen above it all. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor. We stopped in front of Murphy's Motors, the old garage where I had spent my childhood. The building was still the same, though the years had not been kind. The windows were cracked, the doors creaked when you opened them, and the place smelled of dust and old motor oil. But to me, it was home. I swung my leg off the bike and turned to Ella, who had already jumped off, looking up at the garage with curiosity. "This is where I grew up?" I said, my voice quieter than usual. She looked around, taking in the worn walls, the piles of old tools scattered in the corners. "It's a little different than your garage," she said with a grin, her eyes sparkling with mischief. I smiled back at her. "A little." We stepped inside, the familiar smell of oil and metal filling the air. It felt like a lifetime ago when I had worked here with my father, learning the trade, fixing bikes. Now it was just a reminder of what I had lost, but it was also a place where I could start over. The past felt far behind me now. "It's not much, but it's mine," I said, walking over to the workbench and brushing off a layer of dust. "It looks like it could use some work," Ella said, walking around the room. "You know, I could help." I looked up at her, surprised by the suggestion. She had spent so much time watching, learning without me even realizing it. Maybe it was time I started teaching her, really teaching her. "Yeah," I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You think you're ready?" She smiled, her confidence shining through. "I've been watching you. I think I can handle it." I chuckled. "All right then, let's see what you've got." We spent the next few hours working together, fixing up the old garage. It wasn't the same as it used to be, but it didn't matter. We were making it our own. I showed Ella how to tune up an old bike, how to use the tools that had once felt like second nature to me. She picked it up faster than I expected, her small hands steady as she worked. She was determined, and it was clear that she wanted to be a part of this. We worked through the afternoon, the sun slowly setting as we finished the last touches. I took a step back, looking at the garage with a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just a place to fix bikes anymore. It was a place where we could rebuild, where we could start fresh. It felt good, like we were laying the foundation for something new. "We're getting there," Ella said, standing next to me, her eyes gleaming with pride. "Yeah, we are," I replied, looking at her. It was hard to believe how far she had come in such a short time. Just a week ago, she had been a scared kid, and now she was becoming someone strong, someone I could rely on. The past might have haunted me, but now, with Ella by my side, I wasn't afraid to face the future. "What now?" Ella asked, breaking me out of my thoughts. I turned to her, a smile forming on my face. "Now we keep building, one step at a time." We stood there for a moment, the fading light casting long shadows over the garage. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Things weren't perfect. There were still threats out there, and there would always be challenges to face. But with Ella by my side, I knew we could handle whatever came our way. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready. Together, we could face anything. As I looked at her, I realized that I wasn't just rebuilding a garage. I was rebuilding my life. And for the first time in a long time, I had something worth fighting for. The next few days were filled with a quiet kind of tension. The town of Cedar Ridge seemed to be settling into a new normal, but I knew better than to think that the threat had completely vanished. I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming, something bigger than what we had already dealt with. But for now, we were safe. Ella and I continued to work in the garage, fixing up the old bikes, learning from each other. She was eager, her skills growing faster than I could have expected. Every time she picked up a wrench or tightened a bolt, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She was becoming a part of this world, my world, and I couldn't be more grateful. It felt like the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for. But that feeling was short-lived. I knew it was only a matter of time before the Syndicate's grip on Cedar Ridge would tighten again, and this time, it wouldn't be so easy to break free. I had already lost too much, and I wasn't about to lose everything again. One afternoon, as Ella and I were finishing up a repair on an old motorcycle, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the gravel driveway. It was a sound I knew all too well. I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag, and walked toward the door. Ella followed me, her steps light but cautious. I peered out the window and saw a black SUV parked near the entrance. Two men were getting out, both wearing dark suits and carrying an air of authority that made my blood run cold. I recognized them instantly. They weren't just anyone. These men were connected to the Syndicate. They had to be. I could feel the tension in my chest tighten. This was it. They had come for us. I turned to Ella, who was standing beside me, her face pale but determined. "Stay inside," I said, my voice low. "Do not come out, no matter what happens." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust. "Be careful," she said, her voice steady. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the men. They didn't look surprised to see me, but there was a coldness in their eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. I stood tall, my hand resting near the knife at my side, ready for whatever came next. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady but filled with warning. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward, his eyes scanning me as if I were nothing more than a nuisance. "We're here on business," he said, his voice cold. "The boss wants to talk to you. You're causing trouble in his town." I didn't flinch. I knew exactly who he was talking about. The boss. The man who had ordered everything. The one behind the Syndicate's grip on this town. "Tell your boss to stay out of my business," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You tell him that if he wants something from me, he'll have to come get it himself." The man's face twisted into a sneer. "You don't get to make the rules here. You've been warned. The boss doesn't take kindly to people who interfere with his operations. And you've interfered." I could feel my anger rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm not afraid of your boss," I said, taking a step forward. "And I'm not backing down. I've seen what he does to people. I've seen the damage he causes. And I won't let him do that here." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might make a move. But then he looked over at his companion, and they shared a silent exchange. Finally, the man turned back to me. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The boss will make sure of that." I wasn't about to back down. I stood my ground, staring them down, waiting for them to make their next move. But instead of escalating the situation, the man turned on his heel and started walking toward the SUV. "You'll be hearing from us soon," he said over his shoulder. I watched them get into the car and drive off, the dust settling behind them. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. They were serious. They weren't going to let this go. The Syndicate wasn't finished with us yet. I walked back into the garage, my mind already working on the next steps. Ella was waiting inside, her eyes filled with concern. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but anxious. I didn't want to worry her, but I knew she deserved to know the truth. "They came to warn me," I said, my voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "The boss is still out there, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." Ella nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady. I looked at her, a sense of pride swelling in my chest. She was ready to fight, ready to face whatever came next. "Now," I said, my voice firm, "we prepare. We fight back. Together." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a real chance. The Syndicate might be powerful, but we weren't alone. We had each other, and that was all we needed to take them down. The days following the warning from the Syndicate were tense, but we kept moving forward, determined to take control of our future. The garage was no longer just a place to work. It had become our base of operations. Ella and I spent every waking hour there, fixing up bikes, going through old tools, and preparing for what was to come. Ruby checked in often, bringing us news about the Syndicate's movements, but there was no sign of their next move. It was as if they were waiting for us to make the first mistake. I didn't mind the silence. It gave me time to think, but I knew it wouldn't last forever. I had made a promise to myself, to Ella, to the town. No matter what, I wouldn't let the Syndicate destroy what we had fought so hard to rebuild. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Ruby showed up at the garage. Her face serious. "They've made a move," she said, her voice low. My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of move?" I asked, stepping toward her. She handed me a file, its edges worn, as though it had been passed around for a while. They've been buying up land around here. Quietly. I think they're planning something big. And if we don't stop them now, Cedar Ridge is going to be theirs. I opened the file, scanning the details. It was all there, plans for new development, land deals with people who didn't know what they were really signing. The Syndicate was trying to take control of the town, one property at a time. They were going to own this place, and they didn't care who they had to hurt to make it happen. We need to move, I said, looking up from the file. Ruby nodded. I've already called in some help. We're not going to let them take this town without a fight. I turned to Ella, who had been quietly listening in the corner. Her eyes were sharp, focused. She wasn't afraid anymore. Are you ready? I asked. Ella nodded, her chin set with determination. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady. We made a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best we had. Ruby had connections, people who were willing to fight back, and we would use every resource we had to stop the Syndicate before they could do any more damage. That night, we gathered everyone who was willing to help, and we moved under the cover of darkness. The plan was simple. Take back the land the Syndicate had bought, and make it clear that Cedar Ridge wasn't for sale. We weren't going to let them buy this town. As we moved through the streets, I couldn't help but think about how much had changed since that first night I found Ella behind the shed. Back then, it had felt like we were alone, fighting against the odds. But now we were a team. Ruby was leading a group of local residents, people who had seen what the Syndicate had done and were ready to fight back. Ella was by my side, determined, no longer the frightened girl who had been taken advantage of. She was becoming a force to be reckoned with. We arrived at the first piece of land the Syndicate had purchased. It was an old piece of property, an abandoned lot that had once been a factory. The ground was covered in weeds, but I could see the signs of new construction. The Syndicate had already started to build their foundation, but they hadn't expected us to show up. We moved quickly, setting up barricades and putting up signs that read, "This town is not for sale." It was a small act, but it sent a message. We weren't backing down. We were reclaiming our home. As we finished, the sound of sirens in the distance reminded me that time was running out. We had to make our stand before the Syndicate could regroup. But as the sirens got closer, I realized we weren't alone anymore. The town had seen us, had seen what we were doing, and they were coming to help. People who had once been afraid to stand up to the Syndicate were now joining us, rallying around the cause. It wasn't just about protecting Cedar Ridge anymore. It was about standing together, about fighting for a future that wasn't controlled by fear. The Syndicate might have had power, but they didn't have the people. And that was something they would never be able to buy. The police arrived, but we were ready for them. I knew they would have questions, but I also knew that once they saw the people of Cedar Ridge standing together, they wouldn't turn us away. They would have to help us fight back. We stood in front of the barricade, waiting for the Syndicate to show their face. Ruby was with me, her eyes scanning the horizon. Ella was beside her, watching, waiting. The air was thick with anticipation. We weren't just fighting for Cedar Ridge anymore. We were fighting for everything we had built, for every person who had ever called this town home. The sirens grew louder, and then, just as I had hoped, a black SUV appeared in the distance. The Syndicate was here, but this time, they weren't in control. We were. I looked at the people around me, Ruby, Ella, and the rest of the town, and I knew we were ready. No matter what came next, we would face it together. We were Cedar Ridge, and we weren't going anywhere.